Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week I'm going to be taking a look at a subscriber deck submitted to us by Nintendo 64, so thank you very much for submitting the deck. This week we're going to be looking at Jace Controls. So it's a mono blue draw and go control deck that uses Jace's as one of its win conditions. Other win conditions include Thing in the Ice, which will flip after 4 instants and sorceries into Awoken Horror, which is essentially a 3-turn clock that gets a free hit in the first time, for the most part. We've also got ourselves as alternative win conditions. Niblets of Frost, they're pretty decent. They'll lock down our opponent's board while we swing in with our prowess flyers. We've also got Disciple of the Ring as well, which has just text after text after text of things that it can do. We'll get to specifically what it does in a moment. And one of my favourite win conditions out of blue, Dosent of Perfection, which can make a lot of wizards and win that way. So it's basically a control deck that counters everything and then draws when it's not countering. So we're going to go to the beginning of the deck anyway and walk through what we've got. We've got Jace Ravel's Prodigy, the first of our Jaces. 1 and a blue for a 0/2 legendary creature. You can tap him to draw a card and discard a card, so you get to loot in the early game. Really important stuff. Allows you to set up your hand and make sure it is perfect. And if there's 5 or more cards in your graveyard, then you get to exile Jace Ravel's Prodigy and return him to the battlefield transformed under his owner's control. So if our opponent steals it and uses it, it comes back to our side as well. Something that actually has happened to me once before. You get Jace Telepath Unbound anyway when he does eventually flip, so it starts as 5 loyalty. Ticking up 1 allows you to lock down a creature, which is quite important in this deck. So from testing, what I've found is this deck can do quite well as long as it doesn't allow creatures to resolve. Creatures can be a big deal for this deck because once they're down, it's kind of quite difficult to get them off the board again. We've got things like Thing in the Ice to do a mass bounce, but that takes a 4-turn setup, or at least a 4-card setup, which is quite difficult. We've got Grip of the Royal to tap them down, but yeah, we've got to make sure that they don't, if they do stick around, that they're not doing anything. So Jace's +1 is actually, will see quite some use, probably from the matches that you end up seeing. His -3 though is pretty awesome all the same. When you cast an instant or sorcery, you may cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard this turn, essentially giving it flashback, which counts as its converted mana cost. If that card would be put into your graveyard instead, though, it gets exiled. So essentially you get to cast things from your graveyard as long as it's an instant or sorcery. And his ultimate, probably going to see some play, I would imagine, since it is one of the win conditions. You can get an emblem with whenever you cast a spell, target opponent puts the top 5 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So, essentially, you turn every spell into a mill spell. 5 cards, every single spell. Does end up racking up. It is kind of a slow win condition, but it's been pulled off before, so I will expect to see it again. So, Thing in the Ice. 1 and a blue for a 0/4 with Defender. Thing in the Ice enters the battlefield with 4 ice counters on it. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, remove an ice counter from Thing in the Ice, and then if it's got none left on it, you transform it into the Awoken Horror. Awoken Horror is a 7/8, and when he is transformed, he bounces everything that is not a horror back to our opponent's hand. So the likelihood is that we end up bouncing our opponent's entire board, swinging for 7. We only need to do that 3 times, so once we flip the Awoken Horror, that's 2 turns worth of just countering everything our opponent plays, and we can pretty much just get in for the win that way. We got Baral, Chief of Compliance, to make sure that we can cast those instants and sorceries a little better. 2 mana, 1 and a blue, for a 1/3 legendary creature. He says instants and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast, so our 3 mana counter spells become 2 mana counter spells, which means as early as turn 3, if we get ourselves a Baral, we can actually play our Scatter to the Winds and still play a 2-drop, so we could maybe play a Take Inventory to draw cards, a Censor as a double counter, or a Telling Time to go 3 cards deep. He's really useful. And whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. So automatically as well, all of our counter spells have a little bit of grayed out text on the bottom of them that says draw a card, then discard a card, which is Very, very useful in a control deck because it just makes sure that your hand is as good as it could possibly be at any given time. Next we've got Telling Time. These are the early game draw spells for us. Also, they are going to be working on our opponent's side as well because they are instant, unlike the Take Inventories, which I'm not sure about these guys at the moment. In the late game, they are pretty good, and with Baral, of course, 1 mana draw a card is awesome, but I'm not quite sure. Anyway, Telling Time allows us to go 3 cards deep. We get to put 1 card into our hand, the other on top, and the other on the bottom of our library. So we get to find our land drops and set up the thing that we draw next, which is pretty good, pretty valuable. Instant speed, also really useful. You probably want to have at least one of these in your opening hand, just because it helps to smooth out your draw. But if you've got the God hand, you obviously don't really need it. Censor is the first of our counters along the curve. It is 1 and a blue for an instant speed counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. So right at the very early game when your opponent is going through their curve. So we've been going, our turn 2 is Baral, our turn 3 is Scatter. Well, Censor in that case allows us to force our opponent to play off of their curve. If they make their turn 2 play on turn 2, we counter it. If they make the turn 3 play on turn 3, we counter it. So it's essentially in the early part of the game, it is a delay, which is pretty good. In the late game, you can potentially get some lucky Censors off. But if you don't feel like you're ever going to get a counter off of it as well, it's got cycling, so you could pay 1 blue to discard Censor and get a redraw. So you could end up drawing into maybe the land drop you're missing, or even a counter spell that has no condition, which is obviously preferred. Take Inventory is next of our draw spells. 1 and a blue for a sorcery speed. Draw a card, then draw cards equal to the number of cards named Take Inventory in your graveyard. So Take Inventory draws 1 for the first time. Next time it draws 2, next time it draws 3, next time it draws 4. So once you've got a few Take Inventories in your graveyard, this becomes a super efficient, powerful card draw spell, but it does take a little bit of setup. I don't like the fact that it is sorcery speed in a draw and go deck, but in the late game when you've got maybe 6 or 7 mana and 1 counter spell open, of course the sorcery speed becomes largely irrelevant, and therefore these Take Inventories become really good. So I'm not sure about this one. We'll have to see how it plays out, but there aren't really better draw spells around this mana curve, so I can clearly understand why Take Inventory is being played here. We've then got Scatter to the Winds, our first non-conditional counter spell, a beautiful little card. 1 and 2 blue for an instant speed counter target spell, no more, no less. However, if you want to use it for something else in addition to that, it's also got Awaken 3, so if you cast it for 6 mana, 4 and 2 blue instead of the 3, you actually get to put 3 +1/+1 counters on one of your lands, and it becomes an elemental creature with haste. It remains a land as well, so any not bounce non-land permanent things still don't affect that creature. So in addition to maybe getting rid of one of your opponent's threats, you actually add a threat to the board. This could actually be a win condition in itself, depending on the state of the game at the time that you do it. We've then got Broken Concentration, so for 1 and 2 blue instant speed, yet again another unconditional counter spell. It does have the Madness tag as well. So Madness says if you discard the card, you can pay its Madness cost instead to cast it. This might actually come in handy. Because we've got Jace, we can actually use his loot. So in response to maybe a spell that we want to counter, we could loot with Jace and cast the Madness cost instead if we've got 4 mana. Something to consider. I've never actually pulled this off at any point. It probably never even occurs to me if it was a possibility at any time, but something to keep in mind nonetheless, that you can loot this card away in order to cast it for Madness. We've then got 3 copies of Grip of the Royal, 3 mana cost, 2 and a blue. Instant speed, you get to tap target creature and it doesn't untap during its controller's untap step. This is the panic button for if you've allowed an extra creature to enter the board, because sometimes if you're in a swarmy position, you can't always counter everything, so Grip of the Royal allows us to control the board to a certain extent. If we've cast a spell before this as well, we can actually cast it for its surge cost. And it's something to note that the surge cost costs a little less because we've cast something before it, but it's also relevant that Baral, with his cost reduction, does affect the alternative cost on surge. So The surge cost is actually 1 blue mana if you've got a Baral down, so it's something to keep in mind. In addition to all of the things as well, it is a cantrip as well, so we get a redraw. So even after we've tapped down our opponent's creature, we get to draw another card and replace it. So we keep our card advantage essentially. Next we've got 4 copies of Spell Shrivel, 2 and a blue for an instant speed devoid card. Not entirely sure this is going to be relevant as a tag, but the counterspell is certainly going to be relevant. This one is probably one of the best conditional counterspells. Paying 4 can sometimes be quite difficult in a matchup. That's probably why we've got 4 copies of it. It allows us to essentially counter most things, and if we counter them, we exile them instead of putting them into our graveyard as well. So if they're a graveyard-focused deck, or we know that they've got ways of bringing things back to their hand from the graveyard, then we get to exile them. So if it's Reanimator and they've just cast one of their creatures, we can exile it for good, that kind of thing. Next we've got 2 copies of Niblets of Frost, 2 and 2 blue for a 3/3 flyer, pretty good. It also has prowess as well, so whenever we cast non-creature spells, which is 90% of our deck, it gets +1/+1 until the end of the turn. When you cast an instant or sorcery, which is 90% of our deck, you get to tap a creature an opponent controls. That creature does not untap during its controller's next untap step. Yet again, another way of controlling the board if creatures come down. I feel like creature-based matchups are going to be a little bit iffy with this deck. Mostly because we've got panic button situations like the Niblets of Frost and the Grip of the Royal, but we don't really have a great deal of ways of removing them off the board, and I think that might end up being an issue because of course problems always end up piling up in Magic. It's just one of those things, so maybe the deck needs a bit of mass bounce or something like that. Displacement Wave comes to mind. I don't know if it's going to be immediately available. It's also Pull from Tomorrow, which I kind of like. Where are you, Displacement Wave? You're in here somewhere. I don't know. It's like 2 blue and X or something like that. Bounce equal to converted mana cost. It's very useful anyway. Next we got Insidious Whale. So for 2 and 2 blue, instant speed, a modal counter spell, very useful in certain situations. So the first one, counter target spell, real good. Should be for 4 mana at least anyway. The second one allows us to choose new targets for a spell, so if they've pointed a removal spell at our creatures, we can redirect that creature to either one that doesn't have an effect, so if they fatal push one of our 2-drops, we can redirect it to one of our 5-drops, and it'll just fizzle. But if we're doing that, we might as well just use the counter target spell. We can also redirect it to one of our opponent's permanents as well, so if they've made an Anguished Unmaking on one of our creatures, we point it at their Planeswalker, they lose 3 life and lose their creature as well, whatever permanent we chose anyway. We can also copy target instant or sorcery spell as well, so if our opponent draws at the end of our turn, we can copy it and draw ourselves if we choose to do so. And of course we get to choose new targets for that copy as well. We can a fun thing you can do with this, if you get killed by, if you're going to be killed by an X-Burn spell or something like that, you can copy it, redirect it to theirs, and yours resolves first, so if it's lethal for them, then you can win in response, which is pretty funny. You can also just, yet again, choose new targets for the spell, but you get the point. Anyway, 3 copies of Comparative Analysis, 3 and a blue for an instant speed, draw 2 cards. I do believe there is a reason for this card over Glimmer of Genius, mostly because of the surge cost. I do like the surge synergy in this deck, and often, because you're on draw go, it means a lot of the stuff that you're going to be doing on your opponent's turn is going to be a lot of the stuff you do, during the game is going to be on your opponent's turn. So you're going to be drawing cards and countering on your opponent's turn. So why not, after a counter, we reduce the cost of our draw spell with the surge cost? So really nice synergy there. We get to draw 2 cards. We got 1 copy of Illumination. I'm assuming it's here for the early game potential for cycling, but it essentially does the same thing, but without the surge cost. Whether or not this ends up being a profitable swap, whether or not you want 4 comparative analysis instead, is something to be tested, I suppose, but for now, we've got 1 copy of a draw spell. We then got Disciple of the Ring, one of our win conditions and also general annoyance for our opponent. 3 and 2 blue for a 3/4 creature. You can pay 1 to exile an instant or sorcery from your graveyard, 90% of our deck. You get to choose 1 of 4 options, all of them are usually relevant at some point during a game. The first one allows us to counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2. So if our opponent taps out for something, we've got a 1-mana counter spell waiting for them. They'll never do that, but it's something to bait them out for anyway. We can also turn it into a big super creature by doing exactly the same thing to give it +1/+1 until the end of the turn. We can tap down our opponent's creatures, or our own if that becomes somehow relevant, and untap our own or untap theirs if that's somehow relevant. So maybe we want to get an extra trigger on Jace, for example. We can pay 1 to untap him and redraw him. That might be what we need to flip him, for example. Something to be aware of. We've then got Dosent of Perfection. I hope to get at least one flip during our episodes here. We've got 3 and 2 blue for a 5/4 flyer, which is reasonable. That's pretty much all you can say about that. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, however, you get to put a 1/1 blue human wizard token onto the battlefield. Then, if you control 3 or more wizards, so that's after the token gets generated, transform the Dosent of Perfection. The Dosent of Perfection becomes the final iteration. A 6/5 flyer, much better. Wizards you control get +2/+1 and have flying, which means pretty much our entire board goes over the top of our opponent. And it still has the original ability as well of whenever you cast instant or sorceries, you get a wizard token. At this side of the board, though, it is going to be a 3/2 flyer, so that's pretty good every time you cast an instant or sorcery. So you pretty much just leave your counters open to protect your board and protect your Dosent, and you get rewarded for it every single time. It's pretty sweet. Next, we've got Jace, Unraveler of Secrets. 3 and 2 blue for a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. You get to +1 him to scry one and then draw a card. So if you don't like the top card, you put it to the bottom and draw another one. Really good for making sure that you get the right hand for the situation. If we need counters, we get to look for counters. If we need lands, get to do the same. Then -2, more bounce. Really, really necessary in this deck, I would say. Return target creature to its owner's hand. Can be a clutch thing, getting rid of tokens, getting rid of maybe a creature that our opponent's committed a lot of mana to, or a lot of cards to, maybe enchantment wise. We get to bounce that off the board. It's pretty sweet. Maybe counter it even on the way back if that is something we want to do and if we've got counters available. His -8 though is something that we really want to aim for at some point. You get an emblem with whenever an opponent casts his or her first spell each turn, counter that spell, which means from the point of ultimating Jace, every single card our opponent plays gets 2 for 1, so they have to throw away a card to play a card, and if they play that second card, we might have a counter waiting for it, so it's really useful. It's very hard to get out from under. It's not impossible though, I've done it many times myself, so I wouldn't count this as a straight win, but our opponent might straight scoop as soon as they see it. We've then got 2 copies of Commit to Memory, so 3 and a blue for an instant speed. Put target spell or non-land permanent on top into its owner's library, second from the top. So it gets one of our opponent's threats out of the way for a temporary amount of time. Maybe we want to commit it first, counter it later, or maybe we don't have a counter, so we commit it so that we can draw into the counter for later and hopefully find it. It doesn't count as a counter though, because it does not have the word counter, so you won't get the loot off of Baral. It's something to note. It is not countering anything. It is essentially, it's a bounce spell with a different condition, but you can counter things that are on the stack in that sense. You put the spell or non-land permanent into the library, so while it acts like a counter, Remand, if you've ever played Modern, while it acts like that, it's not technically that. If you do get commit into the graveyard though, you can use the aftermath side of it as well. Memory, so for 4 and 2 blue sorcery speed, each player shuffles his or her hand into his or her graveyard, then draws 7 cards. If you are in a control mirror and you are on the lower end of card advantage, this becomes really useful. It can help a little bit with mill. If you commit your opponent's Sphinx's tutelage and then have time the next turn to memory, you get to shuffle your entire graveyard back into your deck without any repercussions. So that's one situation for memory, but mostly it's here for redraws. Never, ever give your opponent card advantage if you don't have to though. If your hand is absolute turbo gash, then of course redraw it, or if you know your opponent has the win condition in their hands, then you can make them shuffle their hand back in. So there are some fringe uses for memory, but I think it's mostly here for the commit side, but also the anti-mill tech as it was. And the mana base is pretty simple. We got 19 lands. not much to say really. We're not really doing anything other than playing lands and passing the turn, so that's essentially the deck, guys. I do hope you enjoyed the look of the deck. If you've got any suggestions for changes, I'd love to hear them in the comments section below. As always, if you want to see some matches as well, wait about 15 seconds for the end card. There will be a link to the first match there. There is a deck list in the description as well if you want to look at a proper list of it. And yeah, like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit that bell icon, and I will see you guys in the games. Bye-bye.